Hi, this is Professor Davenport, and I'm here with Dr. Lynn Sasser, Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Central Oklahoma. And today we're going to be discussing the interplay and interaction between economics and politics. Dr. Sasser, thanks for being here.
Oh, sure, James. I appreciate your having me.
Thank you. One of the first things we wanted to discuss was that economics, which is the study of how goods and services are allocated through a society, is based on two fundamental principles, that being scarcity and opportunity cost. And I was wondering if you could help explain to our students how these two interact with one another and how decisions at a national level are made in line with those two principles.
Well, unfortunately, I think we ignore a lot of that at the national level, but that's another matter. Scarcity basically says that we have unlimited wants and limited resources. Now, we don't always know what the limits are on those resources, but all resources are finite at some point in time. But wants, I mean, are totally infinite because, you know, we can want a variety of things. And so the idea behind economics then is finding the best use for those resources to satisfy as many wants and needs as possible. And then with opportunity cost, all that says is we have to make choices. We can't have everything we want, which again goes back to scarcity. But opportunity cost is every time we decide to do something, we have to give something up. So if we decide to take a parcel of land and build a park, we can't build a shopping center, or vice versa, because we can only use it for one thing. If you decide to do homework, then you can't go shopping because you can't be two places at one time. So we can look at physical resources as well as time resources. Now, the same thing happens with money. If you spend money on tuition, then you don't have money to buy a new car because you've already spent the money. So when you start looking at the national level, if we're spending money on health care, we don't have money available for roads and highways. And so it says then that we need to learn how to make good choices, because the better choices we make, the more efficient use we get of those resources.
But fundamentally, it's the idea that with every decision you make, there's a cost associated
every
with
decision you make, there's a cost associated with it, and that's why we call it opportunity cost, because you give up the opportunity to do that.
Sure. Economist Thomas Sowell, following up a little bit on this, has said that the first law of economics is the law of scarcity, but that the first law of politics is to ignore the first law of economics. Can you kind of explain a little bit about what he's talking about there, and where do you see this kind of mindset happen in practical politics?
Well, when I teach it with my students, I often try to have them think of good economics and good politics like a Venn diagram. And you know, a Venn diagram says that you basically have two circles and you see where the overlap is.
Right.
And ideally, we would have, you know, a really good overlap of good economics and good politics. But what tends to happen is we may have this, or sometimes we even have this, where there is a total disconnect between good economics and good politics. Politicians are operating basically out of their own self-interest. They're operating, looking at their own cost and benefits. Taxpayers are looking at their own benefits and their own cost. And so, you know, for the most part, politicians are there to try to satisfy their voters so they can be reelected. I mean, that's just part of it. And the better the politician, the more concerned they are about being reelected and satisfying their voters or their constituents. And so, you know, they get into these things, you know, of pork barreling or whatever to provide things back to their areas so that, you know, people are happy and people get the things that they want. But it doesn't necessarily mean those are really the best choices for how to use those resources.
They are trapped within their own constraints of
most definitely
decision making and
most
what's best
definitely
for them.
And to get down and try to look at what are societal costs versus societal benefits, that's a whole lot greater, more difficult issue to deal with than to look at just personal cost and personal benefits.
I tell my my students that oftentimes all the incentives are to do sometimes the wrong things, economically speaking, for a politician, you know, to make the wrong decision.
Especially if you're looking at it only in the short term.
Sure.
And that is where we often, even as individuals, and I have, you know, I criticize politicians like anybody else, but hey, they're people like you and me. And they're trying to make those decisions as what they think is best in the short run. And for most of us, the long run is what, an hour? You know, I mean, because we are just very, very short-term oriented. Whereas if we could think, what are the unintended consequences or the long-term consequences of this decision, it puts a different perspective on it.
Very good, very good. Much of the criticism of command socialism centered around two fundamental concepts that I know you're very familiar with. One was the lack of a profit motive, and the other one was just the inability of planners to really get the information they need to make good decisions. Can you talk about how these kind of breakdowns led to the collapse of, say, the Soviet Union and other command socialist type of economy? Well,
what tends to happen with a command-based economy is you do have that planning party that makes the decisions for everybody. And okay, if you make a decision, you're going to make a decision that is in your own self-interest. I mean, that's just human nature. So when those decision makers, this handful of people, are sitting down to make decisions, they're going to make what's in their self-interest. They're not looking at what is in your self-interest. Exactly. They're looking at their own self-interest. And so, for most part, command-based economies get very, very protective, and they want to make decisions that will prolong them. It's somewhat like a monopoly. A monopoly is the most inefficient form of business that there is, because they get very protective and they want to make decisions that protect them from anybody else being able to compete. And so that's the way that a command-based or a socialistic-based economy tends to work when you have that central planning. So there's no incentive, there's no price structure, there's no way for consumers to vote about what they want because somebody else has taken control. Right. Consumers really, and the average citizen really doesn't have much say.
Right. Now, while the trend over the last couple of decades has been across the globe for countries to move away from kind of this command structure, a socialist structure, more to a market-based, still, even in the United States, which is maybe one of the most free market-oriented economies, you see socialistic elements in the economy. What accounts for those kind of things, and what impact do they have on economic performance?
Well, first of all, Hong Kong at one point in time was what we would call the freest of marketplaces because it had the least government. But if you take the U.S. Constitution and look at it, it very carefully spells out what the role of government is: national defense, and there's some mention of public schools, money, a variety of things that government should provide. Now, what we tend to do then as individuals is ask government to provide more and more and more. As we've done that, then we too have moved from, say, over here as capitalistic to really more of a welfare state, welfare economy. And if you look at, say, the Soviet Union, which was a very strong command-based economy, once that fell because of the lack of incentives and structure and whatever, primarily lack of food. I mean, if people don't have food, they're not going to last very long. So that also has moved toward the center. So what we've really seen happen is a lot of the economies have moved where we really have a lot more in common in the center than we do of having extremes. Now, is that good? Is that bad? That's up for an individual to decide as to who can best provide something, the private system or the government.
We also have seen some countries, say like Sweden, that had very broad and hefty welfare states that have kind of reduced some of their benefits as well. So,
well, part of what we've seen happen is the cost. Government, again, as I mentioned in previous comment, government tends to operate like a monopoly, and it's a very inefficient way to do business. And so when government gets involved, it tends to push up cost. And part of your question was, what is the impact on economic activity? Well, if government is pushing up costs, that means you and I are going to have to pay more in taxes. And so it takes more money away from us and gives that money to government. Now, as long as government can provide something that can provide it efficiently, the additional cost of doing that is is less, and the additional cost of that is less than the additional benefit we're receiving, it's okay. But as costs tend to go up, just like with monopoly, you get into very inefficient forms of business and very inefficient ways of doing things, and so your costs start escalating a whole lot faster than the benefits. And there's a lot of people in our economy today that really believe that as government continues growing and growing, we have kind of tapped out, if you will, of the idea that the benefits are greater than the cost. And that's where a lot of the concern in Washington is today.
And it is important to note that there are some of those services that government is responsible and can
absolutely,
do that, right?
Absolutely.
National defense, roads
right.
and
I mean, if my house is on fire, I don't want to have to call 2 or 3 fire departments and try to negotiate a price for them to, to come out and put the fire out. Or, if there's crime in the area, or, if there's an attack on the state, or, Oklahoma City, or, somewhere in the country, we don't want to be calling trying to figure out who can protect us. We need those government services. The question then becomes, how big should government be? How much should government be providing? And again, what can government do better than private industry?
Right. A lot of the political debate over the last couple of years has centered around the national debt. And I was wondering if you could help explain to our students, what really is the impact of the national debt on our economy?
Well, I like to liken the national debt to our own personal debt, because then it makes it something that we can understand. If you go out and you buy something on a credit card, or you go out and you buy something to borrow money in any way to buy it, what you're doing is taking tomorrow's resources, tomorrow's income, to pay for something today, because you're committing for a long-term payment. And that's exactly what the government is doing, because the government doesn't just create money out of thin air. Well, in some ways it does, but it still has to borrow to kind of back that up somewhere along the way, because the government is in some ways like any other business. It has to borrow money, and it has to have those financial resources. And so as government borrows more and more today, it takes less and less away from the future. We are really fortunate right now because interest rates are low. So hey, so what if you're financing debt at 1, 2, 3%? That's very different than if you're financing debt at 10, 12, 15, 20, 25%. So again, take it back. Imagine that you make a purchase on your credit card and your interest rates are, say, 5%. Well, then something happens, and so the credit card company decides they're going to raise those interest rates. What happens to your monthly payments? They escalate. You haven't spent anything any differently, but those monthly payments escalate. So now it takes more of your future resources to buy something that you already, or to continue to pay for something that you've already bought. And that's really where we are today, because there's a lot of rumblings that interest rates will start back up. So we'll be taking that low interest rate and substituting it then with high interest rates. And that's, as we pay more and more, as we make more and more in payments on our national debt, that just leaves less and less money that we can spend, again, roads, highways, public education, whatever.
Many have been critical of the Federal Reserve in implementing a policy called quantitative easing. And this is, for a lot of students, they don't know what that means. So I was going to, hopefully you could explain to them, what is quantitative easing, and has there been a definitive answer as to whether or not it's really been a successful policy?
Well, quantitative easing is basically a way that the Federal Reserve can continue to stimulate the economy. What the Federal Reserve attempts to do is push interest rates down low when the economy is not growing, when you're in a recession. And so they've pushed interest rates almost as low as they can go. And the economy's still been stagnant. So with quantitative easing, what they start doing then is basically buying back their own bonds. And when they buy those bonds, okay, say you have a bond and I'm the Federal Reserve, I take your bond, I give you cash. Now you have more money. And if you have more money to spend, then you will go spend it. There's propensity to spend once we have that money. And so again, that has continued to kind of keep our economy flowing. The trick is, how do we get out of this? without having high interest rates and high inflation. And we are already seeing signs that the end of the quantitative easing, I mean, is the economy is kind of recovering, and so now where do we go from here? And I think there's a lot of questions out there. Has it been successful? Well, the economy is still going. And again, short run, yes. What's the long run impact of this? I think that remains to be seen.
Okay. Now, we talk a lot about taxes impacting the economy or the Federal Reserve, but we know that regulations can also have an impact.
Oh, absolutely. Anytime government passes a regulation, one, you've got to have more people to enforce that regulation, and two, it's an additional cost for business. So if cost for business goes up, okay, now instead of being able to produce more pizzas, I produce fewer pizzas because part of my money has to go to pay for the regulations for health, safety, or whatever, health care, whatever. Okay, so now if I'm producing less, I need fewer employees.
Right.
So if I have fewer employees, now maybe you don't have a job, or maybe you only work 15 hours rather than working 30 hours. And so it can really have a staggering effect on the economy. And if we're not real careful, we can overregulate and drive people out of business, which certainly is not good for any of us.
Sure. Finally, you've taught economics for quite a while. You've saw a lot of questions from students and whatnot. Are there any good books that are out there right now that you would recommend for someone who doesn't have an extensive knowledge about economics but wants to know a little bit more?
Well, one of the things I've noticed in my relatively long career as I start looking at the gray hair and all being earned is that economists in the last maybe 10 years have realized it's okay to have a sense of humor, and it's also okay to put things in common language.
Sure.
I think before we were all a little bit protective of trying to explain economics, thinking it's too complex.
Sure.
But if you look at books like Freakonomics, which is a little bit humorous approach to economics, and then there's The Naked Economist, The Armchair Economist, The Underground Economist. All of those are really short paperback books that most people could sit down and read and understand and really somewhat enjoy, and probably finish it in a couple hours.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you so much for being here
Sure.
with us today. We really appreciate it. I know our students will appreciate benefiting from
Nice to be with
your
you.
insights. Thank you.